The concept of debt jubilee, where all debts are canceled simultaneously by government decree, wiping the slate clean and allowing society to start fresh, seems like utopian fantasy or radical modern proposal, but it's actually ancient practice, documented across multiple civilizations in the ancient Near East, particularly in Mesopotamia, where debt cancellation was regular policy implemented by kings upon taking power or during crises, not sporadic acts of charity, but systematic economic management, and understanding how these jubilees worked, why they were necessary, and what happened when they stopped reveals something fundamental about how debt functions in society, about the inherent tendency of debt-based economies to concentrate wealth and create unsustainable inequality unless periodically reset, and about why modern economies, which have abandoned jubilee and instead allow debt to accumulate indefinitely, face chronic problems of inequality and instability that ancient societies understood and addressed through periodic cancellation. And the most famous debt jubilee, though probably not the most important historically, was the biblical jubilee described in Leviticus, where every 50 years all debts were to be forgiven, all slaves freed, all land returned to original families, essentially a complete economic reset. And while there's debate about whether this was ever actually implemented in ancient Israel, the fact that it was prescribed in religious law shows that debt cancellation was understood as necessary for social stability, that accumulation of debt led to accumulation of land and people in the hands of creditors, creating a class of permanent debtors effectively enslaved, and that periodic reset was the only way to prevent this concentration from becoming permanent and destabilizing. But the Mesopotamian examples are better documented and more clearly implemented. Kings in Sumer, Babylon, Assyria would regularly proclaim indifferentlly or misharum, acts of economic justice that typically included debt cancellation, freeing of debt slaves, and return of land that had been forfeited for debt. The context was agricultural society where most people were farmers working land that might be owned by temples or the state or private landlords or themselves, and agricultural production was subject to enormous variability, good years and bad years, floods and droughts, plagues and wars, any of which could destroy a harvest and leave farmers unable to meet their obligations. And in a subsistence economy where most production went to immediate consumption, farmers had no buffers. A single bad harvest meant they couldn't pay taxes or rents, couldn't feed their families, and the only solution was to borrow, typically from wealthier neighbors or from temple or palace institutions that had stored grain. And this borrowing was at interest, often very high interest. 20 to 33% was common, and the collateral was ultimately the borrower's land and person. If you couldn't repay, your land would be seized. And if that wasn't enough, you or your children would become debt slaves, bonded to the creditor until the debt was worked off. And in practice, debt slavery was often permanent, because the interest kept accumulating faster than labor could pay it down. So a single bad harvest could trap a family in permanent debt bondage. And this happened regularly. In any given generation, some farmers would have bad luck, couldn't pay debts, lost land and freedom. And gradually the creditor class would accumulate more and more land and debt slaves, while the class of free farmers shrank. And this created multiple problems for ancient states. First, it reduced military capacity. Ancient armies were primarily militia, farmers who could afford their own weapons and armor. If free farmers became debt slaves, they couldn't serve in the army, so military strength declined. This was an existential threat in a world of constant warfare. States needed to maintain populations of free farmers who could fight. Second, it reduced tax revenue. Debt slaves working for private creditors didn't pay taxes to the state. Only free farmers did. So as debt bondage increased, state revenues fell even as the wealth being generated remained constant or increased. It was just accumulating in private hands rather than being taxed. Third, it created social instability. Debt slaves and impoverished farmers were resentful, prone to rebellion or to deserting to rival states. And creditors were politically problematic because their interests diverged from state interests. They benefited from accumulating land and people while the state suffered from declining military and fiscal capacity. And fourth, there was genuine concern about justice. Ancient Near Eastern kings saw themselves as shepherds of their people, responsible for ensuring that society functioned properly, and massive debt bondage was understood as injustice. as violation of social order, so kings had both practical and moral reasons to address debt accumulation. The solution was periodic debt cancellation. A new king upon taking the throne would often proclaim a clean slate. Misharum in Akkadian, literally equity or justice, canceling debts owed to the palace and often to private creditors, freeing debt slaves, returning forfeited land to original owners. This wasn't universal. Commercial debts between merchants were typically not canceled. Only agricultural debts owed by farmers, the distinction being that merchant debts were business relationships entered voluntarily for profit, while farmer debts were distress borrowing forced by circumstance. And the cancellation served multiple purposes. It restored military capacity by freeing debt slaves to become soldiers again. It restored tax base by returning farmers to productive land ownership. It prevented creditor class from becoming too powerful and threatening royal authority. And it demonstrated the king's justice and concern for his people, enhancing his legitimacy. And these proclamations were celebrated, announced with great fanfare, recorded in inscriptions, the king presenting himself as savior of the oppressed. And this happened repeatedly. We have records of debt cancellations from multiple kings across centuries. Hammurabi of Babylon proclaimed several. Emi proclaimed one that's well documented in an edict that survives. And the practice continued in various forms for over 1,000 years. It was normal economic policy, not radical or unusual. The effects were dramatic and immediate. Thousands of people would be freed from debt bondage, would return to their land. Families would be reunited. The social order would be reset to something closer to its original distribution. And the economy would be revitalized, because farmers working their own land were more productive than debt slaves working for creditors, had more incentive to improve land and increase production, and paid taxes to the state. So debt cancellation was actually good. Economic policy from the state's perspective increased productivity and revenue even as it wiped out the claims of creditors. And notably, creditors accepted this. There's little evidence of major resistance to debt cancellations, probably because creditors understood that it was going to happen periodically and factored this into their lending. They'd charge high interest rates knowing that some portion of loans would be canceled, and they'd prioritize lending that wouldn't be subject to cancellation, commercial loans rather than agricultural, short-term loans that would be repaid before the next cancellation rather than long-term. And they'd still profit enormously during the periods between cancellations, accumulating land and wealth, and then they'd lose some of it in the cancellation, but not all, not their core wealth, and then the cycle would begin again. They'd lend to the next generation of struggling farmers, accumulate more debt claims, wait for the next cancellation. It was a cycle that everyone understood and adapted to. The biblical Jubilee was more radical than Mesopotamian practice, prescribed to occur every 50 years on a fixed schedule rather than at the king's discretion, and to include not just debt cancellation but land redistribution, all land returning to the families that had originally received it in the allocation when Israel settled Canaan. So even if you'd sold land legally, not forfeited it for debt, it would return to the original family in the Jubilee year. This was intended to prevent permanent inequality, to ensure that every family maintained its ancestral inheritance, that wealth couldn't concentrate indefinitely, and the theological justification was that the land belonged to God, not to people. People were just stewards, and God wanted the land distributed equitably among his people. So even legitimate market transactions that concentrated land ownership violated God's intentions and needed to be reversed. And this is remarkably egalitarian for ancient law, recognizing that free markets and land would inevitably concentrate ownership, and that preventing this concentration required periodic redistribution. Whether the biblical Jubilee was ever actually implemented is uncertain. There's little evidence that it happened in practice. It may have been an ideal that was prescribed but not achieved, or it may have happened in some periods but not others. But even as an ideal, it's significant. It shows that ancient societies understood the tendency of wealth to concentrate and saw periodic redistribution as necessary to maintain social order and justice. The question of why debt jubilees stopped, why this practice that was common in the ancient Near East disappeared and hasn't been revived despite similar problems of debt accumulation and inequality, has multiple answers. First, the rise of money and commercial economies made debt more complex. In ancient Mesopotamia, most debts were grain loans that could be simply canceled. But as economies became more monetized and commercial, debts became more varied and interconnected. Canceling debts in a complex commercial economy would disrupt many legitimate transactions, not just free oppressed farmers. Second, the growth of private property and legal protections for creditors made cancellation harder. Ancient Near Eastern states were relatively autocratic. Kings could proclaim cancellations by decree, but as property rights became more established and legal systems more developed, creditors had more ability to resist cancellation, could argue that their property rights were being violated, could use legal and political means to block it. Third, the creditor class became more powerful relative to the state. In ancient Mesopotamia, creditors were subordinate to the king, had to accept his decrees, but in later societies, particularly in classical Greece and Rome and medieval Europe, creditor classes gained political power, often controlled the state or at least had veto power over policies that threatened their interests, so they could prevent debt cancellation even when it might have been economically beneficial. Fourth, the ideological justification shifted. Ancient Near Eastern kings saw debt cancellation as justice, as restoring proper order, but later ideologies emphasized sanctity of contract, property rights, creditor rights. The idea that debts must be repaid became moral principle, not just legal rule, and canceling debts was seen as theft, as violation of natural law, even when the debts themselves arose from exploitation or misfortune rather than genuine agreement. The Roman Republic's refusal to implement debt cancellation despite repeated calls for it from plebeians drowning in debt, and despite the fact that debt bondage was creating exactly the same problems it had created in ancient Mesopotamia, declining military capacity, social unrest, concentration of land in the hands of aristocracy. This refusal was partly because the creditor class controlled the Senate and could block reforms, but also because Roman ideology venerated property rights and contract sanctity, saw debt cancellation as fundamentally wrong even when debt bondage was destroying society. And the result was centuries of class conflict. The conflict of the orders between patricians and plebeians that nearly tore Rome apart was fundamentally about debt, plebeians demanding cancellation or at least reduction of debts, patricians refusing, and the compromises reached, like the 12 tables that codified law but protected creditor rights, never fully resolved the underlying problem, and debt remained a source of social conflict throughout Roman history, contributing to the Republic's eventual collapse. The civil wars of the 1st century BCE were partly about debt and land distribution. Populars like Julius Caesar used debt relief as political program to build support among the indebted masses, while optimates defended creditor interests. And while debt relief was sometimes granted, full cancellation was never implemented. The ideology had shifted too far toward protecting creditor rights to allow the kind of clean slate that Mesopotamian kings had regularly proclaimed. Modern economies face similar problems of debt accumulation, household debt, student debt, corporate debt, government debt, all growing faster than incomes, creating debt burdens that constrain spending and investment, that transfer wealth from debtors to creditors, that concentrate ownership and wealth, and that periodically trigger crises when debts can't be serviced. The 2008 financial crisis was fundamentally a debt crisis, too many mortgages that couldn't be repaid, and the solution was to bail out creditors, the banks, while leaving debtors to default and lose their homes. Exactly the opposite of what Mesopotamian debt cancellation would have done, which would have canceled the debts and let the debtors keep their homes while the creditors took the loss. And the question of why modern governments don't implement debt jubilee, why they protect creditors rather than debtors, even when this concentrates wealth and creates instability, has the same answers as why Rome didn't. Creditors have political power, control, or heavily influence the state, and ideology has shifted to seeing debt repayment as sacred obligation, default as moral failure. Even when the debts were predatory or arose from circumstances beyond the debtor's control, and the financial sector has become so large and powerful that its interests dominate policy. Banks and bondholders can threaten economic chaos if their claims aren't protected, so governments comply, bail out banks, enforce debt collection, allow inequality to grow, even when this is destructive, and even when historical precedent shows that periodic debt cancellation would be beneficial. The few modern examples of something approaching debt jubilee are illuminating. Germany's debt cancellation after World War II, where the London Debt Agreement of 1953 forgave roughly half of Germany's debts, was crucial to German economic recovery, allowed resources to go to investment rather than debt service, created the economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s. And this was wise policy by Germany's creditors. They recognized that demanding full repayment would impoverish Germany and create political instability. Better to cancel debts and have a prosperous, stable Germany. And this worked. Germany recovered quickly and eventually paid back far more through trade and cooperation than creditors gave up in the cancellation. So it was good for both debtors and creditors in the long run. But this required creditors to think long-term and to accept short-term losses, which is rare. Usually creditors demand immediate full repayment even when this is counterproductive. More recently, the Jubilee 2000 movement that advocated for cancellation of developing country debts achieved partial success. Some of the most unpayable debts of the poorest countries were forgiven, and this helped, allowed resources to go to health and education rather than debt service. But most developing country debt remains, still constraining development, still transferring resources from poor countries to rich creditors, because the ideology and power dynamics that protect creditor interests remain dominant. The arguments against debt jubilee in modern contexts are that it would reward irresponsibility. People who borrowed recklessly would get a free pass, while prudent people who didn't borrow would get nothing. It would destroy trust in credit markets. If people expect debts to be canceled, they won't lend or will charge much higher interest. And it would be arbitrary and unfair, deciding which debts to cancel and which to protect. But these arguments, while having some validity, ignore the broader social benefits of debt cancellation. Just as ancient kings recognized that maintaining free farmers and preventing debt bondage was worth more than protecting creditor claims, modern societies might recognize that maintaining broad prosperity and preventing debt from concentrating wealth is worth more than protecting every debt claim. And the arbitrariness argument applies equally to protecting creditors. There's nothing natural or inevitable about enforcing all debts regardless of circumstance. That's also a policy choice, a choice to protect creditor interests over debtor welfare. And historical experience suggests this choice is often counterproductive, leads to concentration of wealth and social instability, and eventually to crisis that requires intervention anyway, just intervention that protects creditors rather than debtors. The ancient debt jubilee reveals that debt is social relation, not just financial contract, and that society has the power to restructure that relation when it becomes destructive. The Mesopotamian kings understood this, understood that debt claims had to be balanced against social stability and state interests, that creditor rights weren't absolute, weren't more important than maintaining a functioning society. And they used their power to periodically reset the system to prevent debt from creating permanent inequality and bondage. And this worked. Mesopotamian civilizations lasted thousands of years, far longer than any modern state. And while debt jubilee wasn't the only reason for their longevity, it was significant. It prevented the kind of debt crisis that destroyed other societies. And it maintained social cohesion and legitimacy for the state by demonstrating that the king cared about all his people, not just the creditor class. But modern societies have largely abandoned this wisdom, have accepted ideology that sees debt as sacred contract that must be enforced regardless of consequences. And the result is exactly what ancient societies that didn't practice jubilee experienced: growing inequality, concentration of wealth, debt bondage in new forms, social instability, and periodic crises. And while modern crises are resolved through bailouts and bankruptcies rather than jubilees, the effect is often to protect creditors and punish debtors, to socialize losses for the powerful while leaving the powerless to suffer, exactly backwards from what ancient wisdom suggested, which was that creditors, being more powerful and wealthy, should bear the costs of debt cancellation, while debtors, being vulnerable and numerous, should be protected. The possibility of modern debt jubilee remains. Student debt cancellation is periodically proposed in the U.S. Mortgage debt forgiveness was discussed after 2008. Sovereign debt cancellation for developing countries continues to be advocated, and these proposals face fierce resistance from creditor interests and from ideological opposition, but they represent continuity with ancient practice, recognition that debt can become unsustainable and destructive, and that society has the power and sometimes the obligation to cancel it. And if we understood our history better, if we recognized that debt jubilee was normal policy in successful ancient civilizations, was practiced for over 1,000 years by societies that lasted far longer than ours has, perhaps we'd be more willing to consider it now, to recognize that the accumulation of debt we're experiencing, student debt, medical debt, mortgage debt, all growing faster than incomes, creating debt burdens that many people will never escape. This is creating the same kind of social problems that ancient societies addressed through Jubilee: concentration of wealth, reduction in opportunity, creation of permanent debtor class, and that canceling these debts, wiping the slate clean and allowing people to start fresh, might be wise policy, might benefit society even if it harms creditors, might be the kind of economic justice that ancient kings understood they had a responsibility to provide, the ancient debt jubilee that wiped everyone's slate clean wasn't utopian fantasy or economic ignorance. It was sophisticated policy based on understanding of how debt works, how it concentrates wealth and creates bondage if allowed to accumulate indefinitely, and how periodic cancellation could reset the system and maintain social stability and justice. And that ancient wisdom, which modern economics has largely rejected in favor of protecting creditor rights at all costs, might actually be superior, might offer solutions to problems we're struggling with, might show us that the modern idea that all debts must always be repaid regardless of circumstance is neither natural nor inevitable nor even particularly wise, but is instead ideological position that serves creditor interests and that societies that cared about broader welfare would reject, just as ancient societies did through the practice of Jubilee. Regular systematic debt cancellation that prevented the kind of inequality and instability that destroying modern economies now. That's the lesson from ancient debt jubilee. Not that we should literally copy ancient practice, but that we should recover the wisdom that debt is social relation that society can restructure when necessary, that creditor claims aren't absolute, that periodic reset might be healthier than indefinite accumulation, and that justice sometimes requires canceling debts rather than enforcing them, wiping the slate clean rather than letting debt bondage become permanent. This is what ancient civilizations understood and what we've forgotten, to our cost.